The flower fell out of the Bible and landed in the dirt between them, and that was the moment Rebecca Keating understood that Micah Garrett had known the truth all along. She stared at the small, flattened violet pressed so carefully between the pages of Psalms that it had held its color even through 3 seasons of grief, and then she looked up at the man standing across from her in the doorway of the Garrett homestead. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the color of a sky that had already decided to storm. And the way he was looking at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more devastating, something that looked terribly close to grief, told her everything she had been too afraid to ask. "You knew she did this," Rebecca said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You knew your daughter left flowers in this Bible every single Sunday, and you never told me." Micah Garrett did not deny it. He leaned against the doorframe, one hand pressed flat to the wood like he needed the support, and he exhaled a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 2 entire years inside it. "She started doing it before her mother died," he said quietly. "Clara used to press wildflowers too. Sadie picked it up from her, kept on doing it after Clara was gone, said it made her feel like her mama was still listening during the sermon." Rebecca's throat closed. She had been cleaning the Garrett house for 6 weeks. She had been cooking for the man and his 7-year-old daughter for 6 weeks. She had found the Bible on the shelf that first morning, dusted it, placed it back carefully, and thought nothing more of it. Until today, when she had found the fresh violet tucked just inside the cover, placed there not yesterday, not last week, but that very morning while Micah had been out checking the fence line and Rebecca had been here alone in the kitchen. Sadie had left it for her, not for her mother's memory, not this time. The child had left it for Rebecca. And the realization hit her so hard and so unexpectedly that her hands had trembled when she opened the cover wider, and the flower had slipped free and fallen, and Micah had chosen exactly that moment to walk back through the door. "She left it for me," Rebecca whispered. Micah looked at the violet in the dirt for a long time. Then he crouched down, and with the kind of deliberate care that told her this gesture meant something his voice could not manage, he picked it up and held it out to her. "I know," he said. That was when the story truly began. Not with the flower, not with that charged and aching moment in the doorway. It had begun 2 years earlier, in a different kind of doorway, in a different kind of storm, when Rebecca Keating had arrived in Harlan Creek, Colorado, with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of employment, and a dark past she had no intention of sharing with anyone. The year was 1878. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a valley pressed between 2 fingers of the Rocky Mountains, small enough that everyone knew each other's business, and isolated enough that secrets had real staying power. The railroad had not yet reached them. The stagecoach came twice a week. The nearest proper town with a doctor and a judge was half a day's ride east, and that distance made Harlan Creek the kind of place where people handled their own affairs and kept their own counsel. Rebecca had come there because it was far enough from Cheyenne that no one would recognize her name. She had been 24 years old when she climbed down from that stagecoach into the October dust, and the first person she had met in Harlan Creek was not Micah Garrett. It was Dora Mabry, the postmistress, who had looked Rebecca up and down with the practiced eye of a woman who had sorted the mail of an entire community for 15 years, and therefore believed she could sort people just as efficiently. "You the new school teacher?" Dora had asked. "No, ma'am," Rebecca had said. "I am here to inquire about the housekeeping position." Dora's eyebrows had gone up. "Garrett's place. If that is the gentleman who placed the advertisement in the Cheyenne Gazette." "It is," Dora had said, and she had looked at Rebecca with a complicated expression, something between sympathy and warning. "You should know before you ride out there that Micah Garrett is not an easy man. His wife passed a year ago last March. He is raising that little girl of his alone, and he is working twice as hard as any one man ought to work, and he is proud enough that it nearly hurts him to ask for help. He does not want a housekeeper. He needs one. There is a difference." Rebecca had nodded. "I understand the difference, ma'am. Do you have references?" This was the moment Rebecca had prepared for. She had reached into her bag and produced a letter from a Mrs. Harriet Dunmore of Cheyenne, which was genuine and spoke well of Rebecca's cooking, her cleanliness, and her reliability. What the letter did not mention, and what Rebecca had no intention of volunteering, was that she had spent the 2 years prior to working for Mrs. Dunmore as the common-law wife of a man named Franklin Ress, who had turned out to be neither common nor lawful in any sense that mattered. Franklin Ress had been a land speculator, which was a respectable enough title that covered a multitude of sins. He had told Rebecca, when they met in Denver in 1876, that he owned 3 properties outright and was managing investments for several prominent businessmen. He had told her he was a widower. He had told her many things, and Rebecca, who had grown up poor and hopeful in Cincinnati, had believed all of them because she had wanted to, and because Franklin had been handsome and confident and he had chosen her. The truth, which had unraveled itself with the slow horror of a hem coming apart in one's hands, was that Franklin Ress was still married to a woman in Kansas City, that the properties he claimed to own belonged to other men, and that the money he had been spending on Rebecca had been borrowed from people who were not the patient kind of creditors. By the time Rebecca understood the full scope of the betrayal, 2 of Franklin's creditors had arrived at their Cheyenne door, and Franklin had already gone. He had packed while she slept and left her with a house that was not hers, debts that were not legally hers but that people intended to make her problem, and a reputation that had been built on a lie. She had not been ruined in the technical sense. She had been naive, not corrupt. But the distinction meant very little in a town where people preferred a simpler story, so she had left Cheyenne with Mrs. Dunmore's letter and the 2 years of wages she had carefully saved while working to repay what could be repaid, and she had gone looking for a place small enough and far enough that she could start clean. She had found the Garrett advertisement by accident, tucked in a corner of the Gazette between notices for a missing horse and a church social, and something about its plainness had struck her. It had said, housekeeper needed, cooking and cleaning, 1 child in the home, fair wages for honest work. No other requirements, no other requirements. She had read those 3 words 4 times. And so she had come to Harlan Creek, and Dora Mabry had put her on a borrowed horse and drawn her a map to the Garrett place. And Rebecca had ridden out through the golden October afternoon with her carpetbag balanced across her lap and something cautious, but alive moving in her chest. The Garrett homestead sat at the edge of a wide meadow, backed against a pine ridge, with a creek running along its eastern edge. The house itself was log construction, solid and well-maintained in the way that suggested a man who took pride in physical work. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter with more care than she expected from a single man, and a split-rail fence that ran in a clean line all the way to the tree line. Micah Garrett had come out of the barn when he heard the horse. He was 31 years old, tall in the lean, worked way of ranch men, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were already reaching for the fence rail before he had fully registered that his visitor was a woman. He stopped. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, and there was a flicker of something not unwelcome but guarded, as if he had learned to check himself before any feeling could settle. "You are the applicant," he said. It was not a question. "Rebecca Keating," she said, and climbed down from the horse without waiting for help, because she had learned that offering a man the chance to help you before he had decided he wanted to was never a good strategy. "I read your advertisement." He had been quiet for a moment, looking her over with an assessment that was entirely professional and somehow still managed to feel personal. "I expected a woman of more years," he said finally. "I am 24, Rebecca said. "I have been keeping house for others since I was 18. I can cook, clean, manage laundry, tend a kitchen garden, and manage the household accounts if needed. I am not afraid of hard work and I do not require much conversation." That last part had surprised him. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, a tiny loosening as if she had unknowingly answered a concern he had not voiced. "There is a child," he said. "Your advertisement mentioned that." Sadie is 6. She is, he paused, and for a moment the guardedness cracked and something raw moved underneath it. She has been through a hard year. She does not need disruption. I am not a disruptive person, Rebecca said. He had looked at her for another long moment. Then he had said, board is in the back room off the kitchen. Wages are $12 a month. He had named a figure $2 higher than the advertisement, which she suspected was not accidental and which made something in her chest warm slightly, though she did not let it show. That is acceptable, she said. Then you can start Monday. She had started Monday. And for the first 3 weeks, they had maintained a careful, professional distance that suited them both perfectly. He was up before dawn and out working by the time she came downstairs. He took his meals at the table with Sadie and spoke to Rebecca in the practical, abbreviated language of logistics. The well pump needed attention on cold mornings. The flour barrel needed refilling from the supply in the barn. The mare in the second stall was unpredictable around strangers. Sadie, however, had no interest in professional distance. Sadie Garrett was a small, serious child with her father's dark hair and her dead mother's green eyes, and she had her own approach to strangers, which was to observe them silently for exactly as long as she needed, and then ask them one very direct question that cut to whatever she had decided mattered most. She had waited 8 days before she asked Rebecca hers. They had been at the kitchen table, Rebecca mending a pillowcase and Sadie doing her reading lessons, when the child had looked up from her primer and said, without any preamble, "Do you know how to press flowers?" Rebecca had looked up from her mending. "I do," she said. "My grandmother taught me." Sadie had stared at her. "My mama knew how," she said. "She showed me once, but I was only 4 and I cannot remember all the steps." Rebecca had set down her mending. "Would you like me to show you again?" Sadie had nodded, very solemnly. The next morning, they had gone out into the meadow together and collected what late autumn still offered: a few dried goldenrod stems, some pale aster blossoms holding on past their time, a spray of red maple leaves that had blown down from the ridge. Rebecca had shown Sadie how to choose a flat book, not the Bible initially, because the paper was thin, and how to press the specimens between sheets of writing paper, and how to weight the book and leave it for 2 weeks before checking. When they came back inside, hands cold and pink, and Rebecca put the kettle on, she had looked through the kitchen window and seen Micah standing at the fence line. He had been watching them cross the meadow. He had not known she could see him, and the expression on his face had been one she recognized not because she had seen it on him before, but because she had felt it herself. That particular look of someone who had given up expecting good things and is now confronted with something that might be good, and does not yet know whether to let themselves believe it. She had turned away from the window quickly, and when he came in for supper that evening he said nothing about what he had seen, and neither did she. But something had shifted, not visibly, not in any way that could be pointed to and named. Just something beneath the surface of their careful daily arrangement, some tidal pull that had begun, slow and invisible and entirely inexorable. October passed into November, November into December. The mountains closed in around Harlan Creek with the serious intent of a Colorado winter, and the isolation that had seemed manageable in autumn became something different once the first major snow came, something both harder and more intimate. Rebecca's world contracted to the Garrett house, the barn, the path between the two, and the small, warm circle of lamplight at the kitchen table in the evenings. They began to talk. It started with practical things: the state of the cattle, the price of feed at the Harlan Creek General Store, the possibility of the road being blocked through February. But conversation, once opened, has its own momentum, and gradually, over the weeks, it deepened. She learned that Micah had come west from Missouri in 1869, at the age of 22, with his older brother Daniel, and the two of them together had built the homestead from scratch. Daniel had left in 1873, drawn south to New Mexico by a woman he had met at a cattle auction, and Micah had stayed because, by then he had married Clara Walsh. daughter of the sheep farmer 2 valleys over, and because the land had gotten into him in a way that Daniel's had not. Clara had been sick for 3 years before she died, a slow, wasting illness that the doctor from the eastern town had named consumption and treated with rest and tonics that made no visible difference. Micah had watched her diminish while trying to keep the ranch and raise Sadie and pretend, for Sadie's sake, that things were going to be all right. And by the time Clara passed in the spring of 1877, he had exhausted some essential reserve of hope in himself that had not yet fully replenished. He told her these things not all at once, not in any dramatic outpouring, but in pieces, the way a man tells things when he is not quite aware he is telling them, when the telling comes out sideways because the conversation happened to touch that particular edge. And Rebecca, sitting across the table from him with the lamp between them and the snow pressing at the windows, listened with a quality of attention that she had learned from grief, not her own exactly, but the ambient grief of having been close to loss and knowing what it felt like when a person needed to speak and feared no one would understand. She did not tell him her own story. Not yet. The hidden past sat in her chest like a coal, not burning but warm, and every time the conversation moved toward her own history, she navigated around it with a careful skill that she was not proud of. She told him she had grown up in Cincinnati. That was true. She told him she had worked as a housekeeper in several households. That was true. She did not tell him about Franklin Ress, and the lie by omission grew heavier the more she came to respect him. Christmas came, and Sadie's pressed flowers were ready. Rebecca showed her how to peel back the paper carefully, how to handle the dried specimens without breaking them, how to mount them on card stock with a small amount of flour paste. Sadie made a card for her father with a pressed goldenrod stem and 2 dried maple leaves, and Micah had received it with the kind of careful control of emotion that Rebecca was coming to recognize as his truest feeling, that tightening at the throat, that deliberate steadiness that meant something was reaching him deeply. He had looked at Rebecca over Sadie's head, and there was something in that look that she felt in places she had told herself were no longer available for feeling. January was brutal. A storm came down from the north that blocked the road for 2 full weeks, and the 3 of them were entirely alone together, in the way that the Colorado mountains could enforce with absolute authority. Micah spent the daylight hours digging out the barn and keeping the cattle alive, coming in at dusk with ice in his hair and a cold that Rebecca could feel radiating off him from across the kitchen. She had taken to having coffee ready when she heard his boots on the porch, and she had tried not to noticed anyway, that he always paused for a half-second when he came through the door and found her there, as if the sight of a lamp lit and coffee hot was still slightly surprising to him, still something he had not quite let himself expect. One evening in late January, he came in from the barn later than usual, and when he sat down at the table, there was a tension in him beyond ordinary tiredness. Rebecca set the coffee down and was about to go back to the stove when he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." She turned. "I am not asking because I think poorly of you," he said. "I am asking because it matters to me to know." He looked at his hands wrapped around the cup. "You have been here 3 months now. You are good with Sadie. You are good in this house. And there is something about you that does not entirely fit the story you have told." The coal in Rebecca's chest flared hot. "What do you mean?" she said, very carefully. "I mean," Micah said, still not looking at her, "that a woman with your capability and he stopped, seemed to recalibrate. A woman like you does not end up in a remote advertisement in the Cheyenne Gazette by accident. Something happened before this. And I am not asking you to tell me what. I am asking you whether whatever it was is going to follow you here." The silence stretched. Rebecca looked at him for a long time. She thought about the shape of a lie, how it grew and required maintenance, how it always cost more in the end than the truth would have at the beginning. She thought about Sadie's pressed goldenrod on the card. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the kitchen on Christmas morning, and she made a decision. "Yes," she said. "Something happened, and no, it will not follow me here, but I would rather tell you the truth than have you wonder." She sat down across from him and she told him about Franklin Ress. All of it. The meeting in Denver, the things he had told her, the 2 years she had spent in a situation she had not fully understood, the morning she had woken up to find him gone and the creditors at the door. She told him about paying back what she could, about working for Mrs. Dunmore, about the reputation that had settled on her like dust on a surface. Not entirely fair, but not entirely unfounded either, because she had made choices out of desperate hope, and those choices had consequences. She told him all of it in a flat, honest voice, watching his face the whole time, and when she was done the silence in the kitchen was so complete she could hear the snow ticking against the window panes. Micah was quiet for a long moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "He was already married," he said finally. "Yes. You did not know." "No, but I should have asked more questions than I did." "You were 18 when you left home and 22 when you met him," Micah said. "A man who lies for a living is skilled at being believed." He looked up at her then, and there was no judgment in his eyes, none at all, only a kind of deliberate fairness that she found more affecting than any amount of sympathy. "The secret you were keeping does not change anything I already know about you. You have been in this house 3 months. I have watched you with my daughter. I have watched you manage this household. What I know from watching is more reliable than what I could learn from asking." Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, not the cold warmth of hidden shame, but something cleaner, something that moved like water freed from ice. "Thank you," she said. "I am not saying it to be kind," he said. "I am saying it because it is true." He looked back at his coffee. "I would rather have the truth from you, even when it is difficult. That is all I am saying." That was January. By February, the dynamic between them had changed in ways that neither of them acknowledged directly because the silence around what was building felt almost sacred, too new and too fragile for words. Sadie, with the unerring instinct of children, had decided the matter for herself already. She had begun including Rebecca in her prayers. Rebecca had heard her through the bedroom door one evening, and the simple, direct sincerity of a 7-year-old's intercession had nearly brought her to her knees in the hallway. Sadie had also resumed the Sunday ritual. Rebecca had not known about the Sunday ritual until the 3rd week of February, when she noticed that after church, they rode to the Harlan Creek chapel together, the 3 of them, on Sunday mornings. Sadie would disappear into the parlor for a few minutes before dinner. Rebecca had assumed she was playing. It was Dora Mabry, of all people, who had mentioned it in passing one morning at the general store. "That little Garrett girl," Dora had said, "is just the image of her mama. Clara used to press flowers into her Bible every Sunday after service. Said it was her way of leaving something beautiful with the Lord's words. Sadie has picked it up. Micah told me she started it again about a month after Clara passed and has not missed a Sunday since." Rebecca had gone home and thought about that for a long time. The Bible sat on the parlor shelf, dark blue cloth cover worn soft at the corners. She had dusted it dozens of times without opening it. Now, thinking of what Dora had told her, she understood it differently. It was not just a book. It was a conversation between a little girl and her dead mother, conducted every Sunday in the only language Sadie had for the things she could not say aloud. She had not mentioned it to Micah. It felt too intimate somehow, like observing something private that she had not been invited to witness. But that was February, and now it was April. And this morning, while Micah was out checking fence and Rebecca was in the kitchen, Sadie had come in from the parlor after their return from Sunday service. She had been wearing her church dress, green wool with white buttons, and she had looked at Rebecca with those grave, watchful green eyes, and then she had gone and placed a fresh violet, the very first violet of spring, pale purple and still perfectly formed, inside the front cover of the Bible on the shelf. And then she had come to Rebecca, and without a word, she had pressed her small, warm hand into Rebecca's and squeezed it once, and gone upstairs to change out of her church clothes. Rebecca had stood in the parlor breathing carefully for a long time. Then she had gone to the Bible and opened the cover. The violet was there, perfectly placed, the way Sadie always placed them, but this time there was no question that it had been left for someone still living. She had been holding the Bible, the violet caught between the cover and the first page, when Micah came through the door and the flower had fallen. And now they were standing in the kitchen doorway with the flower between them and the whole weight of the past 6 months in the air. And Micah Garrett was holding the violet out to her, with the steady hands of a man who had made a decision. "She left it for you," he said again. He was still holding the flower toward her. "And I think if you are willing to hear it, I would like to tell you why that matters to me." Rebecca took the flower from him. Their fingers touched briefly and neither of them pulled back. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was before something important, gathering it carefully. "Sadie has not trusted anyone since her mother died," he said. "She is polite to people. She is good-mannered. But she keeps herself at a distance in the way that children do, when they have learned that the people they love can leave. I have watched her do it for a year, and I have not known how to help her because I have been doing the same thing myself." He looked at her directly then, without the usual guardedness, and it was like watching a door open on a room that had been kept locked for a very long time. "She leaves that flower for you because she trusts you, because she loves you, and I need you to know that he stopped. I need you to know that it is not just Sadie." The kitchen was very quiet. April light was coming through the window, thin and golden, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was singing, the first one of the season. "Micah," Rebecca said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I came to Harlan Creek because I needed to disappear. I did not come here expecting." She looked down at the violet in her hand. "I did not let myself expect anything." "I know that," he said. "I could see it. You protected yourself in a way that made complete sense given what you told me in January." He took a slow breath. "I'm not asking you to stop protecting yourself. I'm just asking if the protection has any room in it." She looked up at him. "For what?" she asked, though she knew. "For me," he said simply. "For this. For whatever it could be." The truthful answer was already in her before she looked for it. It had been building since October. Since the first morning she had come downstairs and found him already gone and felt the curious ache of a missed greeting. Since Christmas, when their eyes had met over Sadie's head. Since January, when he had listened to the worst of her truth, and his face had not changed except to become more certain. "There is room," she said. "There has been room for a while." Something moved across his face, relief and warmth together. And for a man who had built all of his feelings behind good solid walls, it was the equivalent of a declaration. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took both her hands in his, the violet pressed between their joined palms. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." Rebecca laughed, small and genuine, the first real laugh she had produced in longer than she could remember. "I live in your house, Micah. I am not certain the conventional courtship protocols apply." "They apply," he said firmly. "I intend to do this right." He did do it right. Or rather, he did it in the way that Micah Garrett did everything, which was with deliberate care and a complete absence of fanfare, but with a depth of feeling that expressed itself in steady, concrete gestures that built on each other the way stone courses build a wall. He began to stay at the table in the evenings after Sadie went to bed. That was the first change. Before, he had always retreated to the parlor with his account books or his mending, while Rebecca finished the kitchen work, their evenings running on parallel tracks that never quite intersected. Now he stayed. He brought his books to the kitchen table and worked by the same lamp, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they sat in silence, but it was the kind of silence that was itself a form of company. He found reasons to ride into town on days when Rebecca needed to go to the general store, so she did not have to go alone, and he walked beside her down the one street of Harlan Creek in a way that was visible and intentional. And Rebecca understood that he was doing something important in a town that valued its gossip, which was signaling that she was under his protection, that she mattered to him publicly, which in 1878 in a small Colorado town was a significant statement. Dora Mabry noticed within the week. She said nothing directly, but she gave Rebecca a sack of brown sugar without charging for it and said, "You look well," in a tone that meant considerably more than the words. Micah began to ask her opinion on things. The cattle, the garden, the question of whether the barn needed a new north wall before next winter. He listened to her answers in a way that made her feel that her thoughts were genuinely useful to him, not just tolerated. It was a small thing, but it was not a small thing. He also told her things about Clara. Not with guilt, not with the performative grief of a man trying to establish the right to move forward, but with the honest care of a man who had loved someone and wanted that love honored in the proper way, by speaking of it truly rather than burying it. He told her about Clara's terrible singing voice and her magnificent pie crust. He told her about the spring he and Clara had stayed up all night delivering a difficult calf, and then sat in the barn in the hay, exhausted and triumphant. And Clara had laughed so hard at something he said that she had cried. Rebecca listened to these stories and felt not jealousy but something that was almost like receiving a gift, as if he were trusting her with the most important rooms of his interior life, saying, "Here is who I am, and this is part of it, and I am not going to hide it from you." She began telling him her own stories in return, not the painful ones, those were already told, but the ordinary ones she had not thought were worth telling. Her grandmother's house in Cincinnati, the smell of it, flower and lavender. The creek she had played in as a child. The feeling of reading a book for the first time and discovering that a story could take you somewhere your body could not go. He listened with the same quality of attention she gave him, and she understood that this was what intimacy was, not just physical proximity but this. The willingness to be known, the courage of specificity, the risk of saying here is what I actually am. May arrived, warm and green and busy with planting and calving, and all the work of a ranch coming back to life after winter. There was a dance in Harlan Creek on the first Saturday of May, held in the cleared space beside the feed store, with a fiddle player who drove in from the next town and 2 kegs of local beer, and most of the valley's inhabitants in their best clothes. Micah asked Rebecca if she would go with him. She wore her best dress, dark blue wool she had bought in Cheyenne with her savings from Mrs. Dunmore's household, and she had taken Sadie's carefully saved ribbon and done her hair in a way that she normally did not bother with. When she came downstairs, Micah was waiting in the kitchen in his good shirt and his hat in his hands, and he looked at her in a way that made her very glad she had done something about her hair. "You look," he started. "You were going to say fine," she said. "I was going to say something considerably better than fine," he said, and the slight curve at the corner of his mouth told her he was embarrassed by his own directness and did not intend to be stopped by it. Sadie had declared herself too important not to come along, and had worn her green church dress, and spent the evening holding Micah's hand during the slow songs and pestering Rebecca to dance with her during the fast ones. And the 3 of them had been the center of a particular kind of attention from the community of Harlan Creek that Rebecca felt as warm and unfamiliar as sunlight on skin that has been indoors too long. Micah did ask her to dance formally once during a waltz. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was steady, and he kept his hand at her back with a careful respectfulness that somehow managed to be more affecting than any amount of flourish would have been. They did not speak during the dance. They did not need to. Afterward, riding home under a sky absolutely crammed with stars, Sadie asleep across Rebecca's lap in the wagon, Micah had said quietly, "I want to ask you something." She had waited. "Would you be willing to consider staying here permanently?" he asked. Not as the housekeeper, he kept his eyes on the road. "As my wife." Rebecca held very still. The wagon creaked. Sadie breathed. The stars were extraordinary. "Micah," she said. "You do not have to answer tonight," he said immediately. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I wanted you to know that the question is there, that it is sincere, that it is not said lightly." "I know it is not said lightly," she said. "You do not say anything lightly." He glanced at her then, and in the starlight his expression was open in a way she had only seen a few times, the walls down, the real man visible. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that first." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had rebuilt himself from grief and chosen to build again, who had listened to her worst truth and not flinched, who had shown her what careful love looked like, steady and daily and undemonstrative until suddenly it was not. "I love you too," she said. "And yes, the answer is yes." He did not say anything more. But he reached over and covered her hand with his, and he held it the rest of the way home. They were married in June, in the Harlan Creek chapel, in a ceremony that Sadie considered the most important event that had ever occurred, and therefore prepared for with absolute seriousness. She had pressed flowers for 2 weeks beforehand, selecting the best specimens from the meadow, and she had arranged them in a small bouquet for Rebecca, with a focused intensity that moved the Reverend Parker to clear his throat several times during the preparations. It was a small wedding because there were not many people in Harlan Creek, and a warm wedding because of the people who were there, Dora Mabry, several of the neighboring families, the Reverend and his wife. And it was, in the way of all things Micah Garrett did, done with a completeness of intent that left no room for doubt about what it meant. When the Reverend Parker said the words and Micah put the simple gold band on Rebecca's finger and looked at her, she felt the last of the coal weight leave her chest, the last residue of Franklin Ress and Cheyenne and the story she had been trying to outrun. And in its place, there was something so clear and clean and permanent that she understood it had been there waiting all along, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something worth the pain. Sadie had cried during the ceremony. Happy tears, she was very clear about this distinction, but they had required 3 of Dora Mabry's handkerchiefs and had eventually involved burying her face in Micah's good shirt, while he held her against his side with one arm and kept the other around Rebecca's shoulders. And the moment had been so unscripted and so completely human that several of the guests had needed handkerchiefs of their own. That night, with Sadie asleep down the hall and the June moon pouring through the bedroom window, Rebecca lay in the dark and felt the extraordinary, ordinary weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The house was quiet. The creek was running. Micah was beside her, real and warm and present, and she had not known 6 months ago that this was what she had been traveling toward. She had thought she was running from something. It turned out she had been running toward it. The summer was the fullest summer Rebecca had known in years. Full in the literal sense, the kitchen garden came in abundantly, the cattle were healthy, the hay harvest was good, but full in the deeper sense too, the sense of a life that had texture and weight and purpose in each of its hours. She and Sadie planted sunflowers along the south fence, which was Sadie's idea, and tended them with a shared dedication that became its own small ceremony. She and Micah rode the fence line together on Tuesday mornings, which had started as a practical arrangement, and had become the part of the week she protected most carefully from interruption. Those 2 hours on horseback with the mountains around them, and the conversation flowing or not flowing according to its own will. She learned the ranch in the way she had learned Micah, gradually and with pleasure, understanding its particular rhythms and requirements, its moods in different weather, the way the creek behaved in spring versus summer, the way the cattle moved before a storm. She began to feel that it was hers, not in the legal sense of a deed, but in the lived sense of a place that knows you. And Sadie flourished. The wariness that Dora Mabry had mentioned, the careful distance that Micah had described, it did not disappear overnight, but it thinned week by week as trust built its quiet accumulation. And by August, Sadie had begun initiating contact without waiting for it to be offered. She would lean against Rebecca's arm when they read together. She would reach for Rebecca's hand in church, small things that were enormous things. The Sunday ritual continued. Every Sunday after service, Sadie went to the parlor and added a pressed flower to the Bible. She had expanded her collection now, moving through the seasons as they turned spring violets, summer clover, autumn goldenrod, the occasional winter sprig of dried evergreen. Rebecca had become her collaborator in this, helping Sadie collect and press the specimens through the week so that the Sunday flower was always ready, always its best quality. One Sunday in August, Sadie had presented Rebecca with her own pressed flower, separate from the Bible, a perfect small daisy mounted on a piece of cardstock with her name written carefully underneath in her 8-year-old's determined hand. Rebecca had kept it. She pressed it in her own book, not the Bible but the novel she had brought from Cheyenne, which was the most precious secular thing she owned. She thought of it sometimes, that small daisy, as the first thing Sadie had made specifically for her rather than in her honor, and the distinction felt significant in the way that many small things had turned out to be significant in Harlan Creek. September came, and with it a disruption that Rebecca had not anticipated, though in retrospect she should have. A man arrived in Harlan Creek on the afternoon stage. He was well dressed for the territory, which was to say his coat was cut properly and his boots were good leather, and he had the look of someone who had come with purpose rather than by accident. He checked into the one available room at the Harlan Creek Hotel, which was really just the Mabry family's spare rooms behind the post office, and by the time he had unpacked his bag, the information that a stranger had arrived had traveled to every household in the valley in the particular way that information moves in small towns, by means that are never entirely traceable. His name was Thomas Ress. He was Franklin's brother. Rebecca did not know this at first. She learned it from Dora Mabry, who told her the following morning with the careful expression of someone delivering news they are not sure how to shape. "He is asking after you," Dora said. "He used your previous name, your maiden name. He knows you are here." Rebecca felt the cold clarity of old fear move through her. She set down the package she had been wrapping and made herself breathe deliberately. "Did he say what he wanted?" "He said he had a legal matter to discuss with you." Dora looked at her steadily. "I did not tell him anything, Rebecca. Not where you live, not your married name, nothing." "Thank you," Rebecca said. She went home and told Micah before she had taken her coat off. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, standing in the kitchen with his arms folded and his jaw tight, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "What kind of legal matter," he said carefully, "could Franklin Ress's brother have with you?" "I do not know," Rebecca said. "I paid back what I could. I have a receipt from the principal creditor in Cheyenne. I kept the documentation. I kept everything." She looked at him. "Micah, I kept everything precisely because I knew this could happen. I am not without protection here." The tightness in his jaw did not entirely ease. "I know you are not. I am not questioning your preparation." He looked at her. "I just want to know what we are dealing with before it arrives at our door." "We." She noted that he had said we, and it settled something in her that the fear had been stirring. Thomas Ress arrived at the Garrett homestead the following afternoon. He was a younger version of Franklin with less charm and more visible purpose, and he had ridden out on a hired horse from the livery that he was clearly not entirely comfortable on, which gave him a faintly ridiculous quality that helped Rebecca manage the initial alarm of seeing his face. Micah met him in the yard. "My wife is not available for unexpected calls," he said. It was said with perfect courtesy and absolute finality. Thomas Ress looked at him. "Your wife?" "Rebecca Garrett," Micah said. "Formerly Keating. I believe you were asking after her." Rebecca had watched from the kitchen window, Sadie beside her, and she had felt something fierce and warm move through her at the way Micah stood in that yard, not aggressive, not threatening, simply immovable. A man who had built a life from the ground up and was not about to be moved from it by someone who arrived on a hired horse wearing the wrong boots. Thomas Ress had the grace to recalibrate. "I come only with a document," he said. "A legal settlement. My brother Franklin died in March of this year in Kansas City. There were outstanding debts that were adjudicated as part of the estate." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "The court determined that certain persons who had suffered losses as a result of my brother's conduct were entitled to partial compensation from the estate. Your name was listed." He held the paper out. This is a bank draft. It represents the court's determination of what you were owed. The silence in the yard was long. Micah looked at the paper. Then he looked at Thomas Ress with an expression that was measuring and calm. "Leave it," he said. Thomas left it. He set the paper on the top of the fence post, turned his horse, and rode back toward town. He was on the afternoon stage back east the following day, and Rebecca never saw him again. She and Micah had stood together in the kitchen with the bank draft on the table between them, and it was a complicated moment, not joyful exactly, but something in the direction of completion. The thing she had been running from had caught up with her, and it had turned out not to be a threat at all but a resolution. The court had looked at Franklin Ress's life and found, among its wreckage, the people he had wronged, and decided that a reckoning was owed. The draft was not a large amount, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was final. "What would you like to do with it?" Micah asked. "Sadie's schooling," Rebecca said immediately. "There is that academy in Denver, the one Reverend Parker mentioned, if we could save toward it." Micah had looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had come to know as his deepest feeling. "All right," he said. "Sadie's schooling." He had taken the draft and put it in the locked box where he kept the ranch documents, and that was the end of Franklin Ress in Rebecca Garrett's life. The autumn passed in the good, golden way of autumns in the Colorado mountains, and by October Rebecca had begun to understand something about herself that she had not fully known before, that she was happy. Not the frantic, hope-based happiness of her early years, when happiness had always been conditional on something that had not happened yet, but the deep, present-tense happiness of a life that had found its proper shape. She noticed it in small ways. The pleasure she took in the morning kitchen when the light came through a particular way, and the coffee was just ready, and she could hear Sadie moving around upstairs and sometimes Micah's boots on the porch. The satisfaction of a well-managed household, the physical pleasure of honest work, the way she had stopped bracing for the floor to shift beneath her. By November, she had begun to suspect she was carrying a child. She told Micah on a Tuesday morning on the fence line ride, which was their place for important things. She told him in the same direct way she had come to tell him everything, without preamble, watching his face carefully. He had pulled his horse up and looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened to his expression that she had never seen before, something that cracked through even his deepest reserves, a kind of profound, unguarded joy that was also clearly connected to grief, to Clara, to the children they had not had more of, to all of it, and the combination was so human and so total that Rebecca found her eyes full before she had anticipated it. "Are you?" he started. He stopped. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and he held it in both of his for a long moment without speaking. "Good," he said finally. "That is very good." Sadie's reaction was more theatrical and considerably louder, and involved a period of running around the kitchen that Micah watched with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man whose household had just acquired a new source of high-volume enthusiasm. Sadie had already decided on names. She had a list, and had produced the list by the following morning, written in her careful schoolgirl hand, which Micah and Rebecca had read together at the breakfast table with great seriousness. The list was extensive. Rebecca noticed that all the names on the list were for a girl. She folded it and handed it back to Sadie and said, with great deliberateness, "We will put this in a safe place, but you should know that it might be a boy." Sadie had considered this possibility with the scientific detachment of an 8-year-old. "Boys are acceptable," she had finally concluded. "That is generous of you," Micah said, over the top of his coffee cup. Winter came again, the second winter Rebecca had spent in the Garrett house, now properly her own house, and it was entirely different from the first. The isolation that had felt confining the year before now felt like protection, like the mountains were holding them deliberately, keeping them inside the boundary of their own life while it completed itself. She and Micah read together in the evenings. He had always been a reader, unexpectedly so. He had a shelf of books that she had noticed in October of the previous year, philosophy and history, and one battered volume of Shakespeare that he claimed had belonged to his father and that he reread each winter. She had introduced him to the novels she had been carrying in her bag since Cincinnati, and he had received them with the slightly skeptical openness of a man who does not entirely trust fiction, but is willing to be persuaded. He was persuaded. She found him one January evening, deep in the middle of her copy of David Copperfield, which she had not suggested, which he had simply picked up off the shelf and begun. And he did not look up when she came in, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and she felt a quality of love for him so precise and specific that she thought this is what it means to love someone. Not the general feeling of warmth, but the exact particular person in their exact particular way of being. Reading a novel he did not expect to love with his brow slightly furrowed and his coffee going cold at his elbow. The baby was born on a March morning, a Tuesday, which was their day, and it was a boy. He was healthy and loud, and his arrival was managed by the midwife who rode out from Harlan Creek in the gray pre-dawn. And when it was done, and Rebecca was holding the child and Micah was sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand over hers and Sadie was standing in the doorway in her nightgown with her eyes enormous, the room had a completeness to it that Rebecca felt as a physical thing, as if the house itself had closed a circuit. "What will you name him?" the midwife asked. Rebecca looked at Micah. They had talked about it once briefly and had not resolved it, and she had been waiting for this moment to see what he would say. He looked at the baby, then at her, and something moved quietly across his face. "James," he said, "if you are willing." She did not know the origin. She asked with her eyes. "My father's name," he said quietly. "James," she said. "Yes." Sadie had crossed the room and pressed her face against Rebecca's arm and looked at James Garrett with the odd, proprietary intensity of an older sibling who has just understood the full weight of the responsibility. "He is very small," she said. "He will not stay that way," Micah said. "I know," Sadie said, with the wisdom of someone who had already thought this through. "I will teach him to press flowers." The spring that followed James's birth was the fullest and most complex Rebecca had known in Harlan Creek, full in the way of any season that contains a new person who requires everything and gives back everything in return. She was tired in ways she had not been tired before, a good tiredness, earned and purposeful, but genuine exhaustion. Micah took on more of the household tasks without being asked, which she noted with a gratitude that ran deeper than its immediate cause, which was that it told her what she already knew, that she had not made a choice based on hope this time. She had made it based on knowledge. Sadie turned 9 in April and received, as her birthday gift, the beginning of proper academic instruction by correspondence with the Denver school that Reverend Parker had recommended. She treated this with the gravity of a new vocation and studied at the kitchen table with a focus that sometimes alarmed Micah, who had not anticipated raising a child who considered education a competitive sport. "She is going to be a teacher," Rebecca told him one evening. "Or a judge," he said. "A judge who presses flowers," Rebecca said. He had laughed. It was a sound she had been collecting since the first time she heard it, in December of their first winter, when Sadie had done something with the cat that involved a considerable quantity of flour, and an explanation so involved, and so earnest that Micah had been unable to maintain appropriate parental gravity. She had been collecting his laughs ever since, storing them like Sadie stored pressed flowers, keeping them in the part of herself that needed them most. Summer came back, large and green and loud with cattle and hay work and the busy noise of a ranch in its productive season. James learned to roll over, then to sit, then to pull himself upright against anything stationary, including the barn cat, who bore this with unexpected patience. Sadie taught him, as promised, to hold a flower, though pressing would have to wait until his hands were reliable. The Sunday ritual continued with him present, Sadie now sometimes putting his small hand on the Bible cover before she opened it, including him in the tradition with the same thoughtful care she brought to everything. Rebecca watched this one Sunday in August, the light coming through the parlor window onto both children and the Bible on the shelf, Sadie's careful hands and James's reaching uncertain ones, and she thought of the violet that had fallen in the doorway on an April morning the year before, and of how that small dried flower had been the beginning of everything being spoken rather than held in silence. She found Micah in the barn afterward. He was working on a saddle repair, bent over it in the dust and afternoon light, and he looked up when she came in. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Better than all right," she said. She sat down on the hay bale across from him. "I was watching Sadie show James the Bible." He set down the leather punch. "She will make a good teacher." "She makes a good sister," Rebecca said, "and you make a very good father." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that steady openness she had learned to read as his most complete attention. "I had good material to work with," he said. "You made this," she said. "This life. You built this place and you raised her, and when I came here with nothing to offer but 2 hands and a hidden past, you let me in." She paused. "I want you to know that I am aware of that. I do not think you know how rare what you are is." He got up from the saddle and came and sat beside her on the hay bale, and he put his arm around her and pulled her against his side. "You came here and you made it a home," he said. "I had a house. I had a child and cattle and land. You made it a home. There is a difference." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, she could hear Sadie's voice in the yard, talking to James with the focused narrative energy she brought to all her activities, and the barn was warm with the good smell of hay and horses, and the mountains outside the open door were enormous and permanent and shining in the August light. "Micah," she said. "I would like another one." He was still for a moment, and then she felt him breathe, a long, slow exhale that contained something deeply settled. "So would I," he said, "when James is a little further along." "A year or 2, she agreed. "A year or 2, he said. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "We have time." They did have time. That was the thing about building a life rather than running from one time became something you had rather than something chasing you. The days were full, and the seasons turned with the reliable grandeur of the Rocky Mountain country, and the Garrett homestead grew and changed in the way of all living things that are well tended. The second autumn brought a new neighbor, a family named Aldrich, who bought the old Walsh place 2 valleys over Clara's family's former property, purchased from her cousin after the last Walsh had moved to Denver. Micah rode over to introduce himself, and Rebecca went with him, and they found the Aldrich family, a husband and wife about their own age, with 3 children ranging from 4 to 10, in the middle of unpacking a wagon with the chaotic energy of a family establishing itself in a new place. The Aldriches became friends, which was a thing Rebecca had not had in any of her previous lives, genuine friends built on common circumstances and mutual respect. Eleanor Aldrich was from Ohio, practical and funny, and completely unintimidated by the demands of frontier life, and she and Rebecca had recognized each other as kindred spirits within the first afternoon. Her husband Robert and Micah had the same quality of comfort in silence that men who work land develop, a companionship that did not require constant narration. The children were the most significant development. Sadie, who had been a solitary child by necessity, suddenly had 3 new people in her age range to test herself against, and the effect was visible and immediate. She became more relaxed, more playful. The last of the careful distance that grief had built around her dissolved in the unglamorous business of childhood in a valley where there was always something to argue about, explore, or dare. Rebecca watched this happen over the course of that autumn and winter with a gratitude that she felt as a kind of prayer, not formal but constant, the background radiation of a life that had come right. James began to walk in January, with the unsteady, determined lurch of a child who has decided mobility is non-negotiable. He fell constantly and found it entirely uninteresting, simply getting up and proceeding as before, And Micah watched this with an expression of pure delight that Rebecca thought was one of the finest things she had ever witnessed. The delight of a man who had thought that chapter of his life might be over and found it opened again, fully and generously. By the second spring, Rebecca was expecting again. She told Micah on a Tuesday morning on the fence line, as before. His reaction this time was immediate and uncomplicated, a kind of radiant, unhesitating joy that was different from the first time, less complicated by grief, more purely present. He had reached across and taken her hand the same way, held it the same way, but his face had been entirely open. "Good," he had said. "That is very good." They had ridden the rest of the fence line with their hands linked across the space between the horses, which was not easy and required both of them to pay attention, and was entirely worth it. The second child was born in November of 1880, a girl this time, as Sadie had not so secretly been hoping for, and her arrival was celebrated with the particular intensity that Sadie brought to all major events. She had prepared for the possibility of a girl with a second list of names, which this time she had been careful to provide with equal representation for boys, just in case. The girl was named Clara, without any discussion about it, because both Micah and Rebecca had thought of it at the same time and looked at each other and known, and Sadie had burst into tears that were entirely happy and entirely unself-conscious. And James, now 20 months old, had no opinion on the name but thought the new baby was a fine addition to the household, and demonstrated this by attempting to give her a piece of corn bread within the first 24 hours. Clara Garrett. The name sat in the house with a natural rightness, honoring something without replacing it, carrying forward what mattered. The years in Harlan Creek layered on each other in the way that good years do, each one distinct and complete in itself, but also continuous with what had come before, building something cumulative and dense, and entirely their own. Micah added a room to the house when Clara started walking, and Sadie needed her own space for studying. Rebecca planted an orchard along the south fence, apple and cherry, which would not produce for several years but which she planted with complete confidence in the future, because she had become a person who believed in futures. Sadie continued her correspondence studies with the focused ambition of a child who has understood early that the world is larger than the valley she lives in, and that knowing things is the principal means of reaching it. She was brilliant in a practical, precise way, good at argument and bad at sentimentality except on the subjects she cared about, which were flowers, books, her family, and justice, in no particular order. She also continued the Sunday ritual, uninterrupted. Every Sunday after service at the Harlan Creek Chapel, she went to the parlor and placed a fresh pressed flower in the Bible on the shelf. The Bible had grown thick with them over the years, every page edged with color, the whole book weighted and fragrant with the accumulation of Sundays, and she had begun a second book when the first became so full she feared damaging the paper. She had started teaching James when he was 4. He was not as meticulous as his sister about the pressing. He tended to rush the flattening stage and then wonder why his specimens came out wrinkled. But he had Sadie's genuine interest in the natural world and her patience with waiting for things, and by the time he was 5, he was reliably contributing 1 pressed specimen per week to the family collection. Clara watched this for 2 years, and then, at age 3, she announced her own participation by bringing a fistful of clover to the kitchen table and standing in front of Rebecca with absolute expectation in her green eyes. Clara had her grandmother's eyes, the original Clara's eyes, which was a thing that Micah could still be struck by in unguarded moments, not with pain, but with that particular bittersweet tenderness that is grief transmuted into love. Rebecca had sat Clara down at the table and shown her how to press the clover, step by step, just as she had shown Sadie in the second month of that first Colorado autumn when she had been 24 years old and running from a life that had turned out to be entirely preparatory. She thought of that sometimes. The way Franklin Ress had shaped her by destroying her complacency. The way Cheyenne had made Harlan Creek possible. The way each thing that had seemed only like a loss had been also, in some sense she could not have perceived at the time, a direction. She was not grateful to Franklin Ress. That was not what she meant. What she meant was that she had arrived at her life by a route that included genuine damage and genuine recovery. And the recovery was hers, earned and real, and it had brought her here, to this kitchen table with a 3-year-old pressing clover. And everything had the weight and texture of something she would not trade. One Sunday in the spring of 1883, when Clara was 2.5 and James was 3, and Sadie was 12 years old and possessed of the magnificent certainty of a 12-year-old who is also right about most things, the four of them walked home from the chapel through the meadow as they often did in good weather, Micah carrying Clara on his shoulders, and Sadie walking beside Rebecca with her hand in Rebecca's hand, James running ahead and back the way small boys do, like a dog on a long lead. The meadow was full of violets. Sadie stopped and looked at them, and then she looked at Rebecca, and something moved across her face that Rebecca recognized as memory, as the thing you feel when you understand that you have arrived somewhere important by a long road. "Mama," she said. She had started calling her that in the second year, spontaneously, without ceremony or announcement, simply because it had become true, and both of them had received it as the most natural thing in the world, the thing that had been the case for some time finally having a name. "Yes," Rebecca said. "Will you help me pick violets for this week's pressing?" They spent an hour in the meadow, all 5 of them, James and Clara making more of a production of the searching than was strictly necessary, Micah watching from a dry spot on the ground where he had sat down with Clara in his lap, Rebecca and Sadie moving through the violet-thick grass with the comfortable, unhurried efficiency of 2 people who have done this together many times. Rebecca found the largest, most perfect specimen, deep purple and entirely unbent, and held it up to show Sadie. Sadie took it from her with both hands, the way Rebecca had shown her years ago, carefully at the stem. She held it up and looked at it in the light. "This is a good one," she said. "It is," Rebecca said. Sadie looked at her with those green eyes that were her biological grandmother's and somehow, over 5 years, had become Rebecca's too, in the way that love makes things yours that were not given to you by blood. "I am glad you came here," Sadie said. It was said with the directness of a 12-year-old who has decided something and sees no reason to leave it unsaid. Rebecca looked at her for a moment. The meadow was brilliant around them, the mountains white-tipped and enormous at the valley's edge, James shouting about something in the middle distance, Clara laughing on her father's lap. "So am I," Rebecca said, "more than I knew how to be before." Sadie nodded, with the satisfaction of a proposition confirmed. The following Sunday she placed the pressed violet in the Bible, and she took out the second book of pressed specimens, and she opened it, and Rebecca, sitting in the parlor chair with her mending, watched her turn the pages with gentle hands, all those Sundays laid flat and preserved, the whole history of a small girl's faith and love made visible in color and form. Micah came and stood in the doorway, and they watched Sadie together for a moment, their daughter with the green eyes, turning the pages. "She will keep doing this her whole life," Rebecca said quietly. "I know," Micah said. He put his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Her children will do it too." Rebecca looked up at him. "Is that a prediction or a plan?" "Both," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way she had been collecting for 5 years, that small, genuine, unhurried thing. She covered his hand with hers, and they stood together in the doorway in the Sunday light, while Sadie carefully added the violet to the book and smoothed the page down and closed it with both hands, the way you close something precious, with intention and with care. James appeared at the parlor door, slightly muddy despite having been in church 2 hours before, which was a testament to his commitment to the afternoon. He looked at Sadie. He looked at the book. He looked at Rebecca and Micah in the doorway. "Can I put 1 and 2?" he asked. Sadie opened the book without a word and slid it across the table to him. She had his flower ready, a small pressed buttercup he had selected himself on Wednesday and forgotten about until now. He placed it with great seriousness on the next clean page, pressing it down with one finger, and then he looked up at Sadie for approval. "Good," she said. It was the highest of her assessments. Clara came toddling in behind James, demanded to sit on the table, was placed on the table by Micah, and patted the cover of the book with the flat-handed enthusiasm of a 2-year-old who is mainly participating out of solidarity. Sadie took one of the dried sprigs from the back of the collection, a small sprig of lavender that was not technically pressed, but that Clara had carried to the table with absolute conviction the previous Wednesday, and she placed it on the page beside James's buttercup. 4 flowers, 1 page, 1 Sunday. The tradition that had begun with Clara Garrett in the years before her death, continued by her daughter through grief and faith and the slow rebuilding of a life, carried forward now by the whole assembled family in the gold light of a spring afternoon, in a house that had been a house before, and was now, without question, a home. Rebecca looked at all of it, Sadie's careful hands, James's earnest face, Clara's small palm flat on the cover, Micah's hand steady on her shoulder, and she felt the full weight of it, not heavy but complete, the way something is complete when every necessary thing is present. She had come to Harlan Creek to disappear, and instead she had been found. Not by accident, not by any design more complicated than a 6-year-old girl pressing wildflowers into a Bible and a man who listened without flinching and a valley that held its people close through the long winters and let them grow through the long summers. She had been found, and she was, entirely and without reservation, home. The Sunday ritual continued every week after that, and every week it was full, and every week it was new, different flowers, different hands, different conversations around the table before and after. There were Sundays of cold rain and Sundays of heat so bright the valley shimmered, Sundays of argument and Sundays of laughter and Sundays of the simple companionable quiet that is the mark of people who have learned to be comfortable with each other all the way down. Sadie grew and became exactly what Micah and Rebecca had predicted she would become, a person of formidable intelligence and formidable feeling in approximately equal measure. At 14, she wrote an essay on the injustices of the reservation system as it applied to the Ute people whose land the valley had originally been, and she submitted it to the Denver school with which she still corresponded, and the teacher there had written back that it was the finest essay he had received from a student in 5 years, and would she consider applying for full enrollment. She would. She did. At 15 she went to Denver, the education fund from Thomas Ress's bank draft having grown in the years since it was set aside, and she left with the pressed flower collection in a box that Rebecca had helped her pack, each book wrapped in cloth, because some things travel with you wherever you go. She wrote home every week. She came back every summer. She brought new flowers from the Denver Botanical Society, which was a real place she had discovered with pure joy, and she added them to the collection. And when she came back to the chapel on Sundays, she still continued the ritual without break, because some things are not about geography. James grew into a rancher, which surprised no one who had watched him following his father around since he could walk. He had Micah's steadiness and Rebecca's eye for what mattered, and at 18, he was already capable of managing the herd on his own for weeks at a time, which gave Micah and Rebecca the occasional Tuesday morning on the fence line without logistical urgency. Just the two of them and the mountains and the conversation that had been going for 6 years and showed no signs of concluding. Clara was 9 years old when a 4th child arrived, a boy they named Daniel after Micah's brother who had gone to New Mexico in 1873, and who Rebecca had never met but had heard about enough to feel she knew. And Daniel Garrett arrived in the world with the full-throated opinion of a child who intends to be noticed, which turned out to be entirely predictive of his personality. By the time Daniel could walk, the Garrett homestead had become the kind of place where the word home was not merely descriptive but architectural. It was built into the structure of the thing, into the way the kitchen smelled, and the way the lamp sat on the table, and the way the Sunday Bible, thick with years of pressed specimens, lived on its shelf in the parlor and waited for the hands that always came. Rebecca Garrett was 35 years old in 1889, and she was, by any accounting, exactly where she had intended to be when she was young and hopeful and hadn't yet been shown what hoping wrong felt like, and had been shown it, and had survived it, and had come out the other side to the real version of the thing she had wanted. Not a glamorous thing, not a story anyone would tell as legend, but a life that was entirely and completely her own. Built with her own hands and her husband's hands together, rich with the ordinary miracle of days that accumulated into years that accumulated into something permanent and good. On the last Sunday of September 1889, 25 years exactly after her grandmother had first showed her how to press a flower between the pages of a heavy book, Rebecca Garrett walked into the parlor and found Sadie home for a visit from Denver, where she was now teaching, and James and Clara and small 3-year-old Daniel all gathered around the Bible, which had long since been joined by a third and fourth pressed flower book, the collection now too large for any single volume. Sadie had a late wildflower in her hand, a small gold aster, the kind that bloomed right up until the first frost. She looked at Rebecca when she came in. "Will you do it?" Sadie said. She held the flower out. "This week, I thought you should." Rebecca looked at the flower. She looked at her children around the table, at Sadie, who was 21 and brilliant and entirely herself, at James and Clara and Daniel. Through the parlor window she could see Micah at the fence, mending a rail, his dark hair now touched with gray at the temples, his hands as steady as they had ever been. She took the flower. She carried it to the Bible and opened the cover, and she pressed it gently against the first page, beside all the other flowers pressed there over all the other years, and for a moment she held it there, the gold aster against the worn page, the whole weight of the Sunday tradition in her hands. Then she closed the cover carefully, the way Sadie had always taught, with intention and with care. She turned to her children. "There," she said. Sadie was watching her with those green eyes, Clara's eyes, her grandmother's eyes, filled with a quiet and radiant happiness that Rebecca recognized as her own, reflected back. "There," Sadie said in agreement. Micah came through the door a moment later, brushing sawdust from his shirt, and he looked at the scene in the parlor, his wife, his children, the Bible on the shelf, and the expression that moved across his face was the same one Rebecca had first seen through a kitchen window on an October morning years ago. That look of someone who has been surprised by a good thing and has finally learned to let themselves have it. He crossed the room and stood beside her, and he took her hand, and the 4 children made the kind of noise that 4 children make, and the Sunday light came through the parlor window onto all of them, onto the Bible and the flowers and the people who kept the tradition, because keeping it was its own form of saying, "We were here, and we loved each other, and it was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything." Outside, the mountains were white and permanent against the blue Colorado sky, and the creek was running, and the meadow was still golden before the winter came, and in the Garrett house on the edge of Harlan Creek, the day was good and the people in it were whole, and the story that had begun with a flower falling in a doorway had arrived exactly where it was always trying to go.